So today I'm going to talk about algorithms in practice, comparing web journalism and criminal justice. And I'm actually really happy to be here to present the paper because this project really started last year at the algorithm conference that Morgan, who is struggling with the door here, organized in a masterful way. Okay, so let me start with a tiny bit of background. So, you know, it's not really a surprise. We live in an era of data and cell phones and other things. So we live in an era of data, big data, small data, all sorts of data. So there is an unprecedented amount of digital information being collected, analyzed, and stored about what people do, what they think, and what they buy. So now, when we think of big data, we tend to think about search engines, right? We tend to think about social media and digital platforms. So, you know, the names that keep coming up are Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, etc. But in fact, what I'm arguing in my work is that big data and the computational procedures that go with it are playing an important role in many other fields than the one we always think about, right? From finance to healthcare, public administration, non-profit organizations, policing, criminal justice, education, media, etc. In all of these places, data, digital data, and algorithms are playing an increasingly important role. So now, let me pause for a second. What do I mean by algorithm? So this is kind of a loaded question, and we talked a bit about this at lunch already. The term algorithm can mean like almost anything, really. Often in the media, it's used to describe everything that takes place online. Right? In other cases, only the Facebook newsfeed is an algorithm. Everything else is not really an algorithm. So here, in my work, I'm going to provide some kind of in-between definition. And I define algorithms as computational procedures that draw on some kind of digital data and provide some kind of quantitative output through some kind of digital software program, right? So that's kind of an in-between definition. It's kind of broad enough to like help me talk about what I'm talking about, but it's restrictive enough that it's not absolutely everything, including a cooking recipe, which could also be defined as an algorithm, as computer scientists in my classes like to say. Okay, so now in most of the fields that I mentioned, so healthcare, finance, etc., algorithms defined in that way are deployed to achieve, I think, two main goals. The first goal is to reconfigure the ways in which people make decisions, right? To support and augment decision making. And here the idea is that algorithms are here to replace or complement some kind of traditional form of expertise, be it based on some kind of technical knowledge or some kind of practical knowledge, right? But the idea is that algorithms are here to like help people do that better. And at the same time, algorithms also have a second type of goal, and it's a goal of measuring the performance and productivity of the workers involved, right? So on the one hand, there is something about structuring decision making, and on the other hand, there is something about measuring productivity in quantitative terms. Okay, so that's kind of the introduction. Now, of course, the multiplication of algorithms and more generally of metrics and data in all of these fields has not gone unnoticed. And in fact, there is right now a heated debate about whether algorithms and analytics are good or bad for the fields and organizations that are involved in this process of mediatization through numbers and metrics. So what does this debate look like? Well, like every debate, it has two sides. Actually, three sides, I argue, but really two sides. The first side is the side of the people who really believe that algorithms are just great and are going to help improve all of these fields and organizations. So, you know, big data advocates in Silicon Valley and in other places usually strongly believe in the benefits of algorithmic technologies. And they describe, and that's here the sociology speaking, algorithms as a rationalizing force in the Weberian sense. So what does that mean? Well, it means two things really. The first one is an economic argument. And it's the idea that algorithms are just more efficient than humans. They can process more more information without making the same mistakes. They're faster. They're just better. They're more efficient. The second version of this argument about rationalization is more political, and it's really about objectivity, right? And here the idea is that algorithms can help cure all of these fields I've mentioned from long histories of ignorance, bias, and discrimination. They can help make experts more accountable by providing neutral recommendations that they have to take into account. And this also is an argument that has a long history, right? This argument that machines are more objective than humans is something that Daston and Gallison talk about as mechanical objectivity, and that they trace back to the second half of the 19th century in how scientists started making sense of machines to observe the natural world. So that's kind of the, shall we say, optimistic version of the algorithmic debate, right? And then there is the more critical version of it, which emanates from kind of critical data studies and also now in computer science as well. And here, really the idea is that scholars have been casting doubts on the mythologies that come with big data technologies. The idea is that algorithms with a kind of superior intelligence on the one hand, the idea of black boxing being a second argument, so that's the idea that, you know, instead of making people and organizations more accountable, in fact, algorithms make them less accountable. So why is that? Well, there are several arguments here. The first one is that no one understands how algorithms function, or very few people can understand how algorithms function. That's particularly the case, of course, for machine learning algorithms. And here, Jenna, of course, your work is you know, central for that kind of argument. So there's also the idea that algorithms are proprietary techniques, and so that just we don't have access to them, that companies prevent anyone from kind of looking into it, that kind of opacity. And the third argument is an argument about the alleged neutrality of algorithms. And here, the idea is that instead of minimizing bias, which is what big data advocates often say, right? It's like machines are just better than humans at making decisions, they're more objective, they're just, you know, they don't have the same entrenched biases. Well, in fact, algorithms may have exactly the same problem. And that's because they rely on training data, which is itself skewed and mirrors long history of social and racial inequalities. So having algorithms doesn't solve the problem of inequality, it just puts it in a different form under the guise of kind of mechanical objectivity, right? So that's this field of studies about algorithmic bias, and the question of fairness is very lively right now. I know that several of you were at the Fairness, Accountability and Transparency conference last weekend, and it's a field where like lots of really important studies about algorithmic discrimination are being conducted. So now, this debate is really interesting, and it's making really important points. But I would like to argue that the two sides of the debates have some commonalities, even though they disagree about many, many things. And specifically, they have two main similarities. The first one is that, so far, the debate mostly focuses on the algorithms themselves, on the instruments themselves, how they're produced, how they're built, how they operate, that side of things. And the second commonality between the two approaches is that they often, not always, but often take algorithmic power for granted. What do I mean by that? Well, in the same way that, you know, Silicon Valley technologists think that technology obviously is going to change the world, right? Obviously is going to change the way we do things, and perhaps we're not going to die, you know, in 50 years with a bit of luck, right? Well, there is kind of a similar aspect in how we think about algorithms right now, which is that, well, since algorithms exist, of course they have an impact, and a strong one, on how people do things, right? So, what's missing? Well, I argue that one aspect of the puzzle that is somewhat missing so far is the question of practice. And specifically, that we need to pay closer attention to how people actually use algorithmic technologies in their daily work and lives. So, what does that mean? Well, here we can draw on science and technology studies, which is a field that has a longer history than kind of digital studies, more specifically. But basically, a field that has been arguing against technological determinism, that the uses and meanings of technological forms are always open and flexible. And more importantly, that they vary depending on the context. In other words, and that's another way of making the same argument, the idea of STS is that there is always a gap between the designed and the actual uses of technological artifacts. Now, to relate this question of design versus uses, we can also draw on another debate, which is a debate in sociology and kind of social science more generally, which is a debate about the question of practice. So what does that mean? Well, for thinkers as different as Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, or James Scott, a political scientist, basically, there is this thing in the world which is that observers don't make sense of things in the same way as people. So what do I mean by that? Well, that the way in which people do things, the way in which we do things, can never quite adequately be captured by someone who is observing from the outside. Be it an anthropologist, a sociologist, a state administrator, an economist, or a computer scientist. In other words, the idea that that practice has its own logic, which is not the logic of the external observer, right? So let me take an example to kind of elaborate a bit on this idea of practice. And it's the example of newspapers, which I really like. So when you spend time in newsrooms, which is what I did for my dissertation, I spent a lot of time in newsrooms, and I'll be talking a bit more about that, you realize that it takes a lot of work to put together a newspaper. It takes a lot of work every day. And for the journalists, the editors, the copy editors, the technical assistants, all the people who are here to make the newspaper, well, they do have a specific idea about what kind of uses are gonna come with the newspaper. And specifically, they have an idea a bit like that. And this, by the way, is the first image on Google. You search for reading a newspaper. And it says something about algorithmic bias, right? So I'm not saying that the debate about algorithmic bias is not important. It is very, very important. But basically, journalists and editors, they imagine someone reading a newspaper in a chair to learn about the news of the day. Now, there are other ways to use newspapers. For example, making a fire. And if you've ever made a fire with newspapers, you can know that different newspapers are more or less good to build a fire, right? And actually, magazines usually are really bad, and like newspapers are really good. I mean, anyway, wrapping food is another way to use newspapers. Now, these types of uses are never thought about. I mean, journalists never think about them, but yet they're very important, right? That's another way in which we use newspapers. Okay, so that's just to exemplify the kind of gaps that we have between the design of technical objects on the one hand and the kind of uses that take place on the ground, right? When people actually rely on these objects or these technologies in their daily lives. This leads me to my research program. So I'm an ethnographer, which means that I spend a lot of time with people and I ask questions and I kind of follow them in their work and in their daily lives. I was trained in sociology, now I'm in the communication department, but my method is to do interviews and observations with people to see how they use technological tools in their work. And so I call this program Algorithms in Practice, right? Using ethnographic methods to study the gap between the designed and the actual effects of algorithms on the daily works and lives of people. Specifically, I analyze the ways in which algorithms unfold in expert fields, and here I'm drawing on the Bourdieuian concept of field. I'm happy to elaborate if people have questions, but I'm also happy to keep that for the Q&A and not get into it right now. But basically, I'm interested in the following questions. How do experts use algorithms? What kind of meanings do they give to algorithms? And when and why do they resist or manipulate them? In order to explore this question, I'm developing a multi-sited comparative approach, and specifically right now I'm focusing on two main cases, and I'm actually looking for a third case, so if people have ideas, I will welcome them, because I really want to do a third case, and I have a couple of ideas, but more ideas are always welcome. Okay, so what are my two cases? Well, web journalism is one, and criminal justice is another one. Now, criminal justice and web journalism don't have a lot in common. In many ways, they're actually kind of opposite types of fields, right? On the one hand, you have a public kind of administration, that's the criminal justice one, versus private or for-profit companies, at least in the United States, that's the case of web newsrooms. Web journalism and criminal justice also have different types of professional norms. So in the case of criminal justice, you need a JD, right? And you need to take the bar exam to kind of be able to practice. That's not the case in journalism. I mean, journalists would usually disagree with that, but if I claim to be a journalist, I would be a journalist, basically. You don't need a lot of credentials to be a journalist. And third, the two fields have different degrees of immersion in digital technologies. So what do I mean by that? Well, newsrooms started transitioning to digital platforms kind of early on in the late 90s. Early on, it depends on what you call early on, but in the late 90s is when many newspapers started kind of creating news websites, etc., and transitioning to content management systems that took place online. Whereas criminal courts, this process of transitioning to digital kind of platforms and formats is actually going on right now. So it's just much later in the process. And really, for example, case management systems, which are the systems that are really important in criminal courts right now in kind of pushing files through the procedures, started being developed in the late 2000s, right? And they're kind of gaining ground as we speak. So, different timelines in terms of digital technologies in the two fields. That said, in spite of the differences between criminal justice and web journalism, in both fields, there is a growing role of algorithmic technologies broadly considered, right? Which, once again, to go back to the definition, I define as some kind of digital software program doing on some kind of computational procedure and providing some kind of quantitative output. So let me just briefly introduce the two cases before going to my findings about how people use algorithmic technologies in the two types of fields. So I'll start with the case of online news. So there are many differences between print and online news, and I won't really get into them right now. But what's interesting for our purpose today is that most news websites rely on advertising revenues as their main source of income. Even if they have paywall, advertising revenues remain kind of the main source of money for most news websites. Now, advertising revenues, in turn, are based on many different factors, but it's fair to say that the number of unique visitors that news websites are able to attract per month is a key metric in defining the advertising revenues of news websites. And as a consequence, high traffic numbers have become an absolute priority for most news sites, much more than contributors or paywall, people who subscribe to paywalls. I mean, just massive traffic numbers are a key priority for all news websites across the board. And in parallel, new tools have been developed in order to track traffic patterns in real time and help optimize or maximize the number of unique visitors that news websites attract. So these analytics software programs constitute a booming market. There are literally dozens of companies right now that are selling their product to newsrooms in order to optimize the number of viewers that the website attracts. And so here I'm going to take one example, which is the example of Chartbeat. So Chartbeat was founded in New York in 2009. It's a real-time analytics company. It's the tools that newsrooms like the most. It's used by about 80% of web newsrooms in the US, and newsrooms in many other other countries also license Chartbeat. So now what Chartbeat does, it does a couple of things, right? So it's a dashboard. It gives you the number of concurrent visits on the website at any given moment, gives you the evolution of the number of visits over time. You see that it's kind of going up in the late mornings. That's when people kind of start connecting to news websites more. It gives you a ranking of the most popular articles that kind of moves in real time, right? And then it gives you a sense of traffic sources, so where people are coming from, direct links, social search, etc. And that top links, and also, I mean, there is a bunch of other data about kind of Twitter mentions and other things. Now, all editors and most journalists in web newsrooms are looking at Chartbeat all the time, right? And trying to kind of draw on these numbers to change the kind of headlines that their articles have, or kind of to manage the homepage of their website, etc. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because having these real-time metrics constitute a major transformation for newsrooms between print newsrooms and web newsrooms. So why is that? Well, you know, print newsrooms and print newspapers always had audience data, right? They always had marketing studies where they asked people, why are you buying this newspaper? Which section is the one you like the most? Which section would you like to change? Who is the writer that you like the most, etc. They had these studies. But these studies traditionally were ignored by journalists and mostly journalists and staff writers within newsrooms, who are like, oh, we don't care about what the public thinks. What we care about is the opinion of our peers and superiors, right? So what they cared about the most, and that's something that scholars like Herb Gans have been talking about, is that, you know, for journalists, the most important kind of source of feedback and criticism was the opinion of their peers. So the opinion of other journalists in the newsrooms and of editors. In contrast, real-time analytics are explicitly designed for editorial departments, right? So they're not designed for the marketing side of news websites. They're designed for journalists. And the goal of these analytic software programs is to transform the relationship between journalists and their audience, and to make it more informed, rational, and efficient. A bit like these rationalization programs that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. They want to change the criteria that journalists take into account when deciding what to cover, by putting the public at the center of the newsroom, and by making journalists accountable not to their peers, so not to other journalists, but to the public at large, okay? So let me quote here very briefly from Chartbeat. So it's how the company describes itself, right, and describes its product. Quote, "We are the leaders of the real-time revolution. We partner with doers, editors, writers, marketers, developers to deliver the data they need when they need it. Our real-time information gives them frontline teams instantly understandable data on their users' emergent behavior. It ends a command and control setup where higher-ups dictate tactical moves that the frontline should make. Instead, it empowers the frontline to be autonomous." So now what's interesting in end quote, and so what's interesting in this metaphor is this logic of empowerment, right? That by having real-time data, you have more power, you become more informed, and you can make more rational decisions. So that's the journalism case. Now let me introduce the criminal justice case. So what's going on in criminal justice? Well, over the past 30 years, there has been an important development in the US criminal justice system, which is the development of predictive algorithms to assess the risk of defendants. So right now there are more than 660 risk assessment tools currently used in the US criminal courts, from pretrial to sentencing, juvenile justice, probation, and parole. So what do these risk assessment tools do exactly? Well, they draw on actuarial techniques that come from the insurance sector to assess the risk of recidivism, usually, or sometimes the risk of failure to appear in court, which is something else, and it's as a pre-trial stage, of defendants based on a number of variables. Usually the criminal records of the individual, but also, not always, but often, gender, age, employment status, caregiver status, history of drug abuse, criminal networks, and a bunch of other variables. And let me just mention here that, the number of risk assessment tools and the attention paid to them has been picking up recently, but these kind of predictive statistics in fact have a long history in the criminal justice sector that goes back to the late 19th century and the beginning of the School of Chicago in sociology, and I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. So let me give you an example of what a risk assessment tool looks like, and I very consciously picked one that doesn't look fancy, right? Because that's what most risk assessment tools look like. They don't look fancy at all. So this is the Virginia pretrial risk assessment tools, and it's not only used in Virginia, it's used in many different states, but it was built in Virginia. And so you probably can't see what's written here, can you? No, you can't. Okay, so basically you have, actually I can barely see it myself, so that makes sense. So you have to document a range of variables, right? Here you have,
try to make it a little better.
Yeah, I don't know if
No, I think it's cool.
Okay, anyway, so you have something about criminal history, pending charges, failure to appear in courts, violent convictions, is the length at current residence less than 1 year? Yes, not. Residence verified? Yes, not. Employed? Yes, not. Caregiver verified? Yes, not. History of drug abuse? Yes, not. The type of charges, grand larceny, these kind of variables. And then you have a little button here which says, you can't see it, but I can, calculate risk. And then when you hit the button, you get a risk level or a risk score. Actually, you can turn on the light again. I'm kind of done with that slide. And the risk score usually goes from 1 to 10. 10 means that you're a high-risk defendant, and as such, you should be incarcerated, usually, or put in pretrial detention. And I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. And 1 means that you're a low-risk defendant, and that incarceration is not recommended in that case. Okay, so why use risk assessment tools in the first place? Well, that's where it gets kind of interesting. So what's the situation? Well, the background is that there is this growing realization among US legal professionals that the criminal justice system is in crisis, with more than 1.5 million people behind bars, and the knowledge that, racial discrimination takes place at every single step of the criminal justice process. Now, it needs to be reformed, but how are we going to reform it, right? And that's where technology comes in. For many criminal justice reform advocates, technology is the way to reform the criminal justice system, and risk assessment tools are the way to do it. So how does that work? Well, people are basically drawing on the muddy-balling argument. So the idea is that with strong data and predictive algorithms, we can make more efficient and less biased decisions than what judges and prosecutors are doing kind of on their own. And here let me quote Anne Milgram, who is a former New Jersey prosecutor and head of the Criminal Justice Initiative at the Arnold Foundation, which is one of the main nonprofits engaged in criminal justice reform that has been developing a predictive instrument for pretrial detention. So Anne Milgram says, and here let me quote, "Judges have the best intentions when they make these decisions about risk, but they're making them subjectively. They're like the baseball scouts 20 years ago who were using their instinct and their experience to try to decide what risk someone poses. They're being subjective. And we know what happens with subjective decision making, which is that we are often wrong. What we need in this space are strong data and analytics." So here again, you see this idea that subjectivity leads to error and bias, and that algorithms can help us get rid of that. Now, of course, the problem is that there is another side to this debate, which is that risk assessment tools are also criticized for being unfair and biased. So there was a study by ProPublica journalist Julia Engwin about the Compass risk assessment tool. Probably some of you are familiar with it. So the study basically showed that, I mean, I won't get into the details of it, but that the tool was biased in ways that were very problematic, especially for African Americans who in fact were not guilty of recidivism. So that the tool was much harsher on them than it was on their white counterparts. The study then was criticized by the Compass company, who said that ProPublica didn't use a measure of algorithmic fairness that it should have used. Julia Engwin and her teams then responded to Compass saying that actually their measure of fairness were fine. Computer scientists then entered the debate and argued that there were several competing definitions of algorithmic fairness and that it was really impossible to choose between them. Anyway, it's a big debate. But what's missing in this debate, again, and just not to kind of hammer my point, is that we don't really know how risk assessment tools are being used in criminal courts. We know about the tools themselves, but we don't know about the practices that are associated with them and whether they actually have any impact on the kind of decisions that judges and prosecutors make in their daily work. Okay, so I now move to my own research. So that's what I've been looking at for the past 7 years, how algorithms and analytics are used on the ground. And to do that, I rely on ethnographic methods. So specifically, what I've been doing in the case of web journalism, which was my dissertation topic, is my current book manuscript project, is a multi-sited study of 5 newsrooms in the US and France, which I studied between 2011 and 2015. I did 101 interviews with journalists, editors, community managers, social media editors, just everybody basically who works in the newsroom, and I've been following journalists through their daily work routines. So what that meant is that you have a newsroom where, well, people are usually not sitting like you're sitting, but basically what I would do is just sit here and look over their shoulders for a couple of hours at a time. It's usually a bit embarrassing, right? Because like you can actually see what they're doing on their screen. So I wouldn't do it for too long, but you know, the idea was really to try to see what people are doing on their screens where they're working with computers, and especially how they used you know, real-time analytic software programs when they were opening it, what kind of decisions they were making using these numbers, etc. In the case of criminal justice, I've also been doing multi-sited fieldwork at 3 US criminal courts, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, and one in the South. All of my organizations are anonymized, by the way, so I won't be giving the specific names of the courts and news websites I'm studying. I did 24 interviews with district attorneys, judges, court administrators, clerks, defense attorneys, etc. And I should mention here that the work on criminal justice draws on a previous project that I did when I was back in France, where I did an ethnographic study of a criminal court in the outskirts of Paris during a period of urban unrest, so called the violence urbaine, in 2005-2006, which was published as a book in French. So this interest in criminal justice kind of has a long history in my own work. Okay. So based on these kind of ethnographic methods and on the work I've been doing on web newsrooms and criminal courts, what do I learn? Well, the first thing that I learn, or the first thing I'll be mentioning, is the similarities between the two cases that I'm studying. And now just taking a step back, these similarities are kind of surprising because really these two cases are very different. And they're very different in two main ways, right? First, you know, they're just very different types of professions. And I already talked about that. But second, even the tools themselves are very different. So I talked about Chartbeat and the Virginia pretrial risk assessment tools. They are very different types of algorithmic technologies, right? In one case, it's a dashboard. It's really descriptive. I mean, there is a bit of calculation, like, you know, they're adding time engaged and like number of visitors, but it's mostly descriptive. Whereas in the case of the risk assessment tool, it's a prediction, right? And it's usually based on linear regression, so it depends on the risk assessment tool, but you know, it's some kind of predictive process, which is not the case with real-time analytics, where there is no prediction. Okay, so we're talking about different tools, different types of fields, different types of organizations. It's just really different. Okay, so that makes the similarities even more interesting, in my opinion. So what are the main similarities? Well, the first one is what organizational sociologists call decoupling. And that's the idea of a gap between the official discourses about algorithms, especially at the top of the organizations, where people are like, oh yeah, algorithms are great. We love them. We are so modern. We are so on top of it. We are so data-driven. We're like, we're just at the edge of it, which we're nailing it, okay? So that's what the top of the hierarchy says. And then you start spending time with the kind of daily workers, right? So like the court administrators, the clerks, the editorial assistants in newsrooms, and the actual ways in which the algorithmic tools are being used are in fact much more messy than what the kind of top-down view seems to imply. So why are they messy, and how, in fact, are algorithms used? Well, what I found is that both in the case of web newsrooms and in the case of criminal courts, there is what I call a gamut of buffering strategies. And I say buffering strategies, but really what I mean is resistance. Workers don't like using these tools, and they find many ways for not using them. So in particular, I found three main strategies that they use to not use the tools and to just basically continue doing what they were doing before these tools came into being and just like not really kind of have to deal with them in any kind of way. The first one is foot dragging. So, the algorithms or the analytics program are installed on every single computer. They're printed, they're added to every file, but no one looks at them. So let me give you two quotes, one from a journalist and one from a judge. And you'll see how similar they sound. I mean, at least that's my interpretation. So the first quote is from Sean, who is a staff writer in a New York newsroom. And he says, I quote, "I have access to traffic numbers. They keep sending me links where I can log on and see all that stuff in great details. I can't even remember which proprietary things they use, but I have access to something that shows all the stats, and I just don't look at them. I don't bother. It's not worth it to me. I don't go to Omniture or Chartbeat or whatever it is that they use. I don't go there and obsessively look at the stats. I find it kind of stressful, and I try not to get too wrapped up in that." End quote. So it's like, this is stressful, they keep bothering me with that stuff, I don't want to do it, I'm not opening it. Now the quote from the judge, so that's Judge Lewis in the criminal court located in the south of the United States, who says, quote, "I don't look at the numbers. I don't look at them. There are things you can't quantify. You can take the same case with the same defendant, the same criminal record, the same judge, the same attorney, the same prosecutor, and get two different decisions in different courts. Or you can take the same case with the same defendant, the same judge, at a 2-week interval and have a completely different decision. Is that justice? I think it is." End quote. So in both cases, it's just the idea that numbers don't do justice to what's going on in what they're doing, right? So that's kind of what I call foot dragging. The second strategy is what I call gaming. And here it's the idea that both journalists and legal professionals know very well how to get the numbers they want. So, the numbers are here to rationalize their practices, but they know how to game the system and to get numbers that will kind of show that they're doing the right thing. So what does that look like? Well, for journalists, you have several strategies, and I'm happy to talk much more about it because there are many different details for it. The first one is having a very kind of clickbait-y headline is going to get you very high numbers. So if your editor is putting pressure on you to have high traffic numbers, which many editors do, usually in many newsrooms, there are bonuses. Have high traffic numbers or have articles that are in the top 10 most read box at least several times a month, well, you just put a very catchy headline. Or you go see the editor and make sure that he or she puts in a very catchy, clickbaity type of headline, right? So that's like a first way to kind of game the numbers. And often the headlines have nothing to do with the rest of the articles, as readers, we all know, right? It's like, oh, what a cool headline, and then the article is about something else. Second gaming strategy is, and it's something that journalists talk about a lot, is that in fact traffic numbers don't mean anything because it all depends on how your article is promoted. So it doesn't say anything about the quality of the article, it really says something about where the editor editors put it both on the homepage and where they how much they promoted it on social media, right? So basically, if your articles were put on top of the homepage at 11 a.m. and was heavily promoted on Twitter at 11:30 a.m., you're much more likely to have a high number of visitors than if it was posted at 7 p.m. and not mentioned on Twitter. So basically, what journalists do is put a lot of pressure on social media editor and homepage editors to push up their articles and give them a shot kind of on top of the website. So that's the second way of kind of manipulating traffic numbers to get the kind of stats they want. What about criminal justice? Well, here again, several types of gaming strategies. The first one is to try to select the kind of cases that you get and try to get rid of problematic cases, kind of pushing them to some of your colleagues. Academics do that too. But just kind of trying to pick as much as you can the kind of cases that you're going to have in your court. The second type of gaming strategy in criminal justice is to manipulate the variables in the risk assessment tools to get the kind of risk scores that you want to get. So how does that work? Well, so the people who use risk assessment tools are usually pretrial officers and probation officers. These are the main ones, and district attorneys too, but really pretrial and probation people are the ones who fill up the risk assessment tools. Now, when you work with these tools every day, you know very well which variables have a lot of weight. You know which variables are driving the final risk score. And so you just kind of change the variables a bit when they're a bit subjective, for example, right? So for a bunch of risk assessment tools, there are variables that have a bit of a subjective tinge to them, where you just kind of change them to get the risk scores that you want to get. And many probation officers and pretrial officers, they never said that they were doing it, but they said that they very well could do it. Okay, so I never observed it in person, I have to say that. Other people have found it, especially Kelly Hannah-Moffat, who has been working on risk assessment tools for a long time. But I've never observed it in person, but they all mentioned that they could do it if they wanted to. The third buffering strategy that I found is open critique. And here it's basically just using a very critical discourse to explain why you're not using these predictive or algorithmic technologies. So what does that look like? So let me give you a quote from Philippe, who is an editor-in-chief of a Parisian website. Quote, "I don't follow Chartbeat much. I try not to look at it. When you look at Chartbeat all the time, you make choices that might not be the best ones for the identity of the media. If we only cared about Chartbeat, it would be simple. We would only write about celebrities. Celebrities, it always works. But that's not the kind of credibility we're looking for. In the long run, when it gets too trashy, people move somewhere else." So here, basically, it's like equating Chartbeat with clickbait and saying, we don't want to do that. We're looking for another type of credibility, right? A different type of credibility. And therefore, we're not going to be using Chartbeat. So what about criminal justice? Well, here again, legal professionals are not stupid. They're reading the newspapers, they're reading ProPublica. And so here, for example, I interviewed John, who was a former prosecutor on the East Coast, and who told me, quote, "Risk assessment tools, they're very controversial. When I was a prosecutor, I didn't put much stock in it. I'd prefer to look at actual behaviors. I just didn't know these tests, how they were administered, in which circumstances, with what kind of data. With these tools, the output is only as good as the input, and the input is controversial." Right? So it's like garbage in, garbage out kind of things. So this is a criticized tool. Why would I bother using it? And I don't know who's building the tool. So, critical arguments to justify why they're not using the tools in their daily work. So these are the similarities between the two cases, and I think it's striking because these are very different cases. And so the fact that I find these very similar ways of not using algorithmic technologies, I think indicates that this type of behavior and this type of resistance may be going on in many other fields that we're not thinking about, right? From healthcare to finance to many other domains, that in fact people are developing all of these ways for not using digital technologies and algorithmic technologies in their daily lives. And so that's something that we should keep in mind when we think about these tools, which is that perhaps they don't have the kind of effects that we think they have. Perhaps, in fact, no one cares. And I'm not saying that no one cares, but I'm just saying that we could consider the idea, okay? So now in the last part of this talk and in the conclusion, let me just talk a tiny bit about variation. So far I've focused on the similarities, but there are of course many differences between these two cases. And here I'll go kind of quickly, mostly because this is still a work in progress and I'm not yet completely sure about what's going on and what are the main differences. But basically there are many differences between the case of criminal justice and the case of web journalism. And I'll just put it kind of out there. So basically there is much less resistance to analytics in the case of journalism than in the case of criminal justice. Basically, journalists are much more obsessed with real-time analytics than judges and prosecutors and probation officers and all of these people are in the case of criminal courts. And there are several interpretations for why this is the case, and I'm not sure which one is going on, so I would love feedback. But basically, my main interpretation at this point is that in the case of web journalism, real-time metrics are a bit of an ambiguous object, because on the one hand, there is a signal of market pressure, right? So it's like, it means traffic numbers, it means advertising revenues, and as such, journalists have a very critical discourse against it, right? They're like, oh, like, the market, like, it's all going down the drain, you know, no one's willing to pay for news, so, you know, they could resist it. But at the same time, traffic numbers, and especially real-time traffic numbers, it also says something about your impact in the public sphere, and about the fact that people like your articles and are reading them. And when you're a journalist, it's important that people are reading your articles. It's a bit like academics, once again. It's like, you know, I'm really against metrics in academia. Now, you know, when my article is downloaded 5,000 times, I'm kind of happy because I wrote it to be read. So, you know, I still think it's bad, but, you know, and so for journalists, it's kind of the same thing. They're writing their articles because they want to be read. And so having real-time metrics, you know, it says something. It gives them a high. And that should be taken seriously. Whereas for the case of legal professionals, basically what risk assessment tools are telling them is, oh, we're going to use the exact same variables that you're already taking into account. Criminal history, violent history, socioeconomic variables, basically how stable you are in terms of housing, employment, you know, family situation, etc. But instead of letting you do it, we're going to have a black boxed algorithm do it for you. And you're going to have to trust its results. Now, for judges and prosecutors, this just doesn't sound like a good deal. It's like, well, why should I trust an algorithm to do something that I'm already doing, knowing that I've been a judge for like 30, 40 years? And also, you know, so why should I trust it? And so I think that's part of the story here. But I think there are many other factors going on, and I just kind of list them out there. One of them is who promotes algorithms. And here the situation is a bit different in web newsrooms and criminal courts. And I just won't go into it because I want to leave time for the discussion. Second one is what kind of metrics are being promoted and how transparent they are. And here again, I think in the case of journalism, real-time metrics are just very transparent. It's the number of unique visitors. There is no debate about how it's calculated. It's just pretty clear. Whereas in the case of criminal justice, risk assessment tools are quite kind of opaque, and no one really knows how the risk scores are constructed. And so the kind of transparency of the metric is just like kind of different. The third one is the degree of interference with the work of experts, and that's kind of what I talked about. But you know, it interferes in different ways with what people are used to doing. And the last one is the role of hierarchies and organizational structures. And here, basically, to go very fast, newsrooms are very hierarchical. So when your editor tells you to do something, you have to do it. So when your editor tells you you have to look at metrics, I mean, you know, but basically the editor is entitled to give you this order, right? Whereas in the case of criminal courts, especially for example if you're a judge, and especially if you've been elected, you can have a court admin, you can have like the technology team be like, hey, we have this fancy new tool, you should really use it. But judges can very well say, well, no, in fact, I'm not going to use it. And you know what, like I've been elected, I mean, I'm not accountable to you guys. I'm accountable to the people who elected me. So, you know, just there are like all of these different variables that I'm still trying to work out, and I would love feedback on that. Okay, so let me now conclude. In this presentation, I talked about algorithms in practice, and against the rhetoric of algorithmic power, which I certainly hear a lot about on the other side of the bay, I argue that the reality of how algorithms are used is often messy and complicated. In other words, that there is often a gap between the intended and actual effects of algorithmic technologies. Specifically, I compared the cases of criminal justice and web journalism, and I found both similarities, especially in terms of resistance and kind of decoupling processes, but also differences, right? So that's the idea that algorithms and analytics are integrated into different professional arrangements and routines, which themselves depend on the history of the field under consideration. In other words, that algorithms can function as symbolic resources. We all project different things onto these tools, depending on where we come from and what we're used to doing. And to conclude, I would like just to, conclude with a call for further qualitative research on the reception of digital and computational technologies. I think that it's great that we have this growing body of work examining in critical ways how technology is constructed, especially in Silicon Valley, but in many other places as well. I think this is amazing and needs to be done, but I also think that we need to study the reception side almost as much, as much as the construction side, right? And the reason for that is because it is in these micro level uses and interpretations that we can find space not only for compliance but also for resistance. Thank you. I'll stop here.
So I'm wondering if there is a way to assess the hypothesis that says, so when you're wondering if people actually, if it actually has an impact on judges, for example,
Yep.
The result, just get some data and
Yep.
try to compare.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I've been looking for someone to do a quantitative study of this for a very long time, and I actually found someone 2 weeks ago. So I haven't read her articles. I have a 3-month baby at home. I've been looking at the abstract though, and basically what she found, and her name escapes me right now, but she's a legal scholar at Penn. Pretty sure it's Penn, and she's been doing this quantitative study looking at comparing how judges who use risk assessment tools, their sentencing decisions compared to judges who don't use risk assessment tools. She doesn't enter the risk scores themselves because she didn't get access to them, but at least she can measure the impact of having risk assessment tools versus not, and basically she found that there was no significant difference, which goes in my direction, so I was super excited about it, but yeah. So I think that this is the type of studies that we really need to do. The problem with that, and once again, is that it's a question of having access to the data, and many courts are are not super keen on sharing data, especially with respect to risk assessment instruments, because, and that's not to criticize ProPublica, they're doing an amazing job, but the whole Compass thing just made everybody, I think, very nervous. Anyway, so there's a problem of having access to data, but I think it's a great research program, actually. Yeah.
One small niggle there. When you talk about the positive side, mentioned Weber and rationalization, and Weber was not positive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Disenchantment, iron cage, doom and gloom, almost too much so.
Yeah.
But my question was, you said, technologies can be embedded in different contexts, in different ways, newspapers, but I think in the case of newsrooms, it was pretty unambiguous. These tools are just being used more and more widely. I think that's a form of power. And, while you may have noticed resistance, it's not my area, but, anecdotally, you talked about obsession, and you talked about how prevalent these tools have become, and also giving more power to the public. There's two sides to that, right? There's also, the public dictating what newspapers want. Newspapers may not like it, but it puts power in different hands. So what do you think?
So first about Weber, absolutely. I mean, I don't think Weber would be super thrilled about algorithmic kind of technologies. He would probably not be absolutely positive about it. I'm just thinking, I mean, I was using the term rationalization more as these ideas that, like, you know, it's like a discourse that big data advocates kind of rely on when talking about kind of a new efficiency that, like, these types of quantitative technologies enable in administrations, among other places. So I'm definitely with you on that. With respect to the journalism case, first, there are significant differences between newsrooms in how much resistance there is, and I have actually an article forthcoming next month in the Empirical Journal of Sociology where I compare newsrooms in the US and France and how they make sense of audience metrics. And what I find is that depending on the newsroom, there are significant differences. Some newsrooms are just much more immune to the pressure of clicks than others, and it matters, and it also has an impact on the kind of content that they produce. So that's the first thing. But then, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I agree that audience metrics are playing an increasingly important role in the production of news content. Just, you know, generally speaking, that's certainly true. Yet, at the same time, there are also kind of counter movements, and so one of them, which I find really interesting, is finding alternative metrics, right? So basically saying, well, unique visitors is, I mean, first clicks is one thing, page views is one metric, but that just doesn't really matter anymore. Unique visitors is another metric, but now what some newsrooms are moving towards is time engaged. So time engaged is the amount of time that readers spend on a given article, and basically that's said to be great, both because it gives a sense of the quality of the article, right? I mean, just because if it's a bad article, you're not going to stay for more than 3 seconds, but also because even in terms of advertising, it could actually be a relevant metric because people would see the ads longer if they stay longer on the article. So even from a kind of more financial perspective, it would also make sense. So it's a very disputed and contested area. So there is room for change. I'll just say that. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I was interested in knowing, these domains that you have been researching are domains where basically you have a choice in order to, like, take in the information of an algorithm or not. Have you considered, like, looking into domains where the risk is much higher?
So can you...
Be like, aviation, for example, or like your agency.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. So we were talking about aviation, like, for most of our lunch, and I actually think that aviation is an amazing, it's like, it would be a great, so some kind of case where the outcome where the outcome would be just much more dramatic, right? That's I mean, aviation.
Or medical emergency rooms, for example, where you have to really, like, trust, like, an algorithm. There's a lot of work being done in order to get people to trust the information you get from an algorithm.
Yeah.
It's like make the information more human.
Yeah. So healthcare is really interesting. If people know, and we talked also a bit about that at lunch, but, like, if people know of studies that examine specifically how much physicians rely on automated or on kind of metrics and analytics and algorithms to make decisions, I would love to get these references, because I've been kind of looking for things and I haven't found anything kind of super in-depth about healthcare. So I think this is a very good thing. Anecdotally, I've heard from several different people who study healthcare, but not specifically algorithms and analytics, that physicians kind of resist using them also, but it's anecdotal. So if someone has a reference to share, I would very much like that, because I think the case of healthcare is really interesting. So yeah, yes.
So you've highlighted some of the differences between the systems. There are these two other differences that to me seem to be interesting as, and one is, while it might not be a healthcare decision, it is a much more serious decision. Right? As you said, in addition to the fact that one is descriptive and one is predictive, we also have people being detained physically by the state. And we have another where people are deciding what stories they're going to write next and what headlines, and that seems like something to engage with. And then the second is the lack of, like, the closed feedback loop, right? Like, in the journalism context, that's kind of a closed feedback loop. And in the other, there's very little accountability built in, either for the people who are determining what factors to enter or not enter, whether to be truthful or not truthful, the judges, whether to use it or not use it, and the person who's affected by all of that is not the person who has any control over any of it, right?
That's really interesting. So can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by closed feedback loop? I mean, I see what you're, but I would love to hear more.
Well, the person who's deciding whether or not they're going to pay attention to the thing that their boss wants them to pay attention to is the person who's going to suffer probably if their articles end up not being particularly well read or whatever. Right? The person who's deciding whether or not to use the risk assessment tool, as you said, they're, okay, maybe you end up not getting reelected because you're using the risk recidivism tool, but my guess is they're not keeping records about whether or not people...
Yeah, so that's really interesting,
so there's no accountability.
Yeah, so that's right, and that's not quite right at the same time. I mean, I certainly agree. I mean, I do think that it's a very important difference, but at the same time, what I find interesting is that in the case of the 3 criminal courts I've been studying, you're right. They're not looking at rates of recidivism at all. It's like, I mean...
No, use of the tool. Are they?
No. So they're not looking at that, and they're not looking, but they're not keeping track also of how accurate risk assessment tools are. It's like, they're just not keeping track of that at all. That's like way beyond any of their kind of administrative capabilities. It's just like, not at all. But at the same time, so the 3 courts I studied were having huge financial difficulties. Huge, and basically they didn't have enough beds and enough cells in the jail attached to the court. They had a real kind of budget and kind of infrastructure problem. And that, in turn, led to some kind of accountability mechanism, because somehow the administrators started looking at which judges were sending more people to jail or to prison compared to which other judges. And so basically they started having, in two of the 3 courts that I studied, judges started to have to look at their incarceration numbers. So now that's not risk assessment tools. I agree, it's incarceration.
Right, it would have happened when they had the risk assessment tools.
Yeah, but to me what's interesting is that it also meant that basically the technology teams of 2 of the 3 courts that I studied were like, oh, but we can help you make these decisions. With our risk assessment tools, you'll be making better decisions. So I agree with the grand scheme of the kind of the difference between the 2 things, but I do think that there is a moment right now in criminal justice where just all the kind of case management systems are transitioning to online case management systems, and there is a real kind of financial crunch on like most of these courts, and so that everybody's starting to pay attention to the numbers much more than they used to. Now that's not specific to risk assessment tools, so your point like definitely stands, but there is a kind of movement in that direction, which I find kind of interesting. That's a great point. Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. As an advocate for myself, I totally appreciate all this sometimes boring time we probably spend in the newsroom. So I was wondering about the term the experts. So you said that you were interested in how the experts use this algorithm. And I had the feeling that your work also showed that specifically this role of the expert is what's getting transformed here. So these buffering strategies or the strategies of obfuscation against this algorithmic management forms seems to fight exactly against the algorithm being the expert. And I was wondering if this is another difference or maybe similarity between the cases, because in the court case, I guess the judge in the end stays the expert, but in journalism, I guess it changed a lot. So during these board meetings, I can imagine that the one who's able to read the data analytics in the end is now much more powerful during the decision-making process than the traditional.
No. I mean, what's kind of interesting with traffic numbers, just to kind of, it's like kind of diverging a bit, but it's relevant to what you're saying, is that it really goes against the traditional hierarchy of newsrooms. So traditionally in newsrooms, international news was kind of the most prestigious journalists who are doing international news, right? And then political news and culture and the arts, and then at the very bottom, lifestyle and kind of celebrity stuff. Not surprisingly, when you start looking at traffic numbers, actually lifestyle and celebrity is what's kind of at the top, and international news is at the bottom. So what's interesting is that in many of these cases, numbers are used to kind of redefine hierarchies within organizations, right? With like lifestyle bloggers being like, hey, you're like star kind of international news correspondent who's paid like 10 times more than I am. Well, I'm bringing like 10 times more kind of advertising revenues than he is. Usually it's a he, and the lifestyle blogger is usually a she. So, perhaps we should change that so that there is this kind of redistribution of power within these organizations to some extent, because then, of course, like there are also many other ways, as I talked about, to ignore the numbers and to not pay attention to these kind of new ways of making people accountable. In the case of newsrooms, I think, in the case of courts, I think that what's interesting is that there is the same redistribution of power, and I think Deirdre's question is kind of going back to that too, which is that, so who is filling up risk assessment tools? Well, it's not the judges. The judges are never kind of typing the variables within these tools. It's not what they're here to do, and they would see it also kind of a bit below themselves to kind of do that. The people who are filling up the tools are pretrial officers, probation officers, and sometimes clerks or court administrators. I mean, depends a bit on the court. But basically, they're like, they're kind of the lowest level kind of type of staff. I mean, no, that's not true, but they're kind of low level type of staff within the court system. But now, with these tools, they have much more power than they used to in some kind of way, because they're the ones kind of dealing with, algorithmic technologies and kind of building the risk scores. And they are building expertise on these tools. As I showed, it's like they can manipulate them, they know how they work. So there is also a kind of redistribution of power within the court context, but much less, I would argue, and I think you're right, than in the journalism context. That's a great point. Yeah.
Just one question to your observations with the criminal justice system. How much time does a judge or a probation officer actually spend with the entire case, and then spending with platform or risk assessment tools?
Yeah.
Just in terms of observation of time.
Yeah. So that's a very complicated question to answer, actually, just because through the procedure, there are many different types of hearings and many different, so it's just really hard to say, basically. It really depends on the court, it depends on the case. Now, what I can tell you is that with respect to risk assessment tools, in most courts, they're actually printed out on a piece of paper and added to the paper file of the defendant. So no one's dealing with any screen at all. And it depends on the court. Once again, it depends on, usually district attorneys are a bit more on top of computer stuff than judges. I mean, it depends a bit, but usually it's a sheet of paper, literally, in a file that has 200 pages, and it's one of 200 pages. And so the answer to your question is that most of the cases I've seen, it's not mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. Is it then that they will look at the actual score, and that would be it for the judges?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So basically, so I showed you like the Virginia pretrial example. So then the next page is like a page with the risk scores, and usually there are a couple of risk scores. You have like a general risk score, and you have a risk score for violent recidivism, a risk score for failure to appear in court. I mean, you have a bunch of risk scores, and that's a sheet of paper that's printed out and added to the file of the defendant. Yeah.
Are there other examples of algorithms in practice that you've seen that have been insightful?
Sorry?
Are there other examples of algorithms in practice, like just other ethnographic research that you've taken inspiration from, or maybe has come to similar conclusions that you have?
Tons. No, not tons, but so Karen Levy's work on trucking is like super relevant, because it's kind of, we did our PhDs together, so it's not completely random that we're finding kind of similar results, but still, where she shows that truckers have many different ways of kind of gaming the kind of monitoring systems that are put in place in the trucks, right? Another person is Alex Rosenblatt, who works on Uber, and who finds that Uber drivers, same thing, like, you know, they have this kind of platform which like is really kind of an oppressive platform in many ways that kind of dictates their every move, how much they're paid. It's completely opaque. They don't know like how the states, how anyway. So, but they still find ways to kind of game it in some kind of ways. And also they have these forums. So she published an article recently where she showed how Uber drivers like share a ton of information on forums that usually they kind of use to kind of work as a collective and to game the platform collectively, which I find like really interesting. So these are like, I mean, they're both good friends, so you know, in a way, it's like citing your friends is just, yeah, it's kind of cool. But like, I think that there is like, we need much more kind of stuff, much more work on like these kind of resistance strategies. And so I would love to see more on healthcare. I would love to see more on finance. I would love to see more on like all of these fields where, and if people have ideas of references that I don't know, I would really want them. So, and Jeff is going to give a guest lecture in my class on finance, so I will know more, yeah.
Oh, I can give you a reference afterwards. I do have a question.
Okay, so just, do you mind, sorry, first because you had your hand up for a while and then we'll, no, sorry, just behind.
Yeah, I just had a question about the subjectivity that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think as you were talking about like the variation in the type of variables that go into the criminal justice models, as well as who is actually scoring them. I assume that most of the time it's law clerks, but
yeah. I mean,
so I guess I was just wondering what your thoughts were in terms of comparing what the impact of that subjectiveness is in the newsroom versus in the criminal justice case, and how does that impact I guess you said some of the actors were kind of not willing to participate, and is that a big factor in that?
That's really interesting. So, I mean, I think, let's see. I think that talking about subjectivity is usually an argument that's deployed by people who are against subjectivity. You know, it's like, you're never going to say, oh, like, you know, subjectivity is great in newsrooms or in criminal justice. It's not something that you're going to hear for two reasons, right? I mean, in newsrooms, because journalists, especially in the US, but increasingly in other countries as well, have this norm of objectivity, these ideas that like journalists shouldn't take sides, right? And they should just report a fact, just a fact, which like obviously is not true, but you know, it still functions as a powerful kind of discourse. And same thing in criminal courts, right? Where like, you know, there is this idea that you should take into account the kind of individual characteristics of the case, and that's kind of a very important part of what's going on, but at the same time you shouldn't kind of, I mean, well, it's a much more complicated debate. But I think that in both cases, and I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but in both cases, subjectivity is seen as something kind of dark and mysterious, and that can lead to bias, but in ways that we don't really know how to acknowledge or address. And that's the reason why kind of technology is seen as an easy fix. Does that make sense? Am I answering your question or not really? Because I may have lost track.
Yeah, I think I just thought it was interesting that you first brought up subjectivity as a reason why these tools are being used.
Yep.
But particularly as you're talking about criminal justice, I realized that seems like a very subjective process that is probably, I would assume, in the 3 different courts, very different in terms of, you know, the types of variables, how they're scored, everything.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was interesting that, like, in an effort to...
Yeah, got it. Yeah. So, okay, so that's like, for me, that's like actually a really important point about risk assessment tools, and I'm kind of, which is that, like, you know, we keep hearing that risk assessment tools may be more objective, but there are like more than 60 risk assessment tools out there, and there is no kind of protocol for deciding which risk assessment tools to use, and which ones are good ones or decent ones versus which ones are really, really bad ones. And so in that case, it just moved the subjectivity to like another place, right? So yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. Is that a follow-up on the...
Is it okay to follow up? Well, I just want to say, and you know, you have to look at the risk assessment tools against the backdrop of things like mandatory minimums, sentencing guidelines, all of which, under the claim of objectivity, have ended up being really horrible in particular parts of the population, and those at least have the benefit of being transparent and politically determined, etc. And so it, like, you know, it's a claim about a particular kind of objectivity.
And so I completely agree. I mean, I think that using numbers to kind of anchor your claims to objectivity has a long history in criminal justice with kind of mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines. What's interesting is that now we see this like extra rhetoric of like, oh, we're going to bring Silicon Valley to criminal justice, kind of, and it's just really kind of, it's just really problematic. I mean, it adds like another layer to this kind of long history. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is sort of a follow-up question to your much earlier question. So another way to think about this feedback loop that you see in the case of journalism is that the journalists are themselves the object. The quantification process that they're also users of it, which is presumably not the case in criminal justice. The judges themselves are calculating their own assessments. And so because of that, Turkey is journalists in coupling that you're describing, collaboratively buffering journalistic autonomy or something. Predictive elements or phrases, suggestions, back human labor in which the metrics are kind of explained over. That can explain some of the variation that you're seeing, and also there's an equivalent phenomenon at the level of criminal, the predictive risk assessment.
That's such a good question. Okay, so so that's I can see that. Okay, so what's really interesting about Chartbeat is that they try really hard not to be the bad guys. They really try hard not to be the bad guys, right? So like they keep going to newsrooms and they're like, oh, we don't want you to do clickbait. We really don't want you to do clickbait. We want quality. We want quality journalism. We are not about traffic numbers. And you're just like, yes, you are. Like, I mean, yes, you are. Like, I'm sorry. But so it's interesting because I agree that there is a lot of mediation work that takes place in kind of trying to be like, of course you have your professional autonomy and we don't want you to sacrifice that. And, you know, the tool is going to reflect like that in kind of different ways. But there is also this kind of decoupling thing. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think, so then also like journalists are basically become the object of the algorithmic output versus judges don't. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, I guess I'm asking is the same kind of selling work that Chartbeat does to get their metrics into editorial offices. Does that work also exist at the level?
Yeah, it does, but not for all the risk assessment tools. So basically some, so for example, the Arnold Foundation, which is super active in criminal justice reform, and they're very actively promoting their own risk assessment tool, which is called PSA Court, and it's a pretrial one. And they're extremely active in kind of promoting it in jurisdictions and collaborating with academics to kind of assess, you know, how much it decreases pretrial incarceration, among other things. So yes, there are the same kind of entrepreneurs, right? Kind of institutional entrepreneurs being like, look, we're on the good side of things, technology can help us. But what's a bit different is that, you know, in the case of web journalism, I mean, you know, it is a booming market, but at the end of the day, there are what, like a dozen real-time analytics software program, max, really, I mean, really more like, anyway, really more like 3 or 4. I mean, you know, especially on real-time stuff. Whereas in the case of risk assessment tools, you do have more than 60. So there is also just a difference in like how fragmented the market is, basically, or the field is. It's much more fragmented in the case of criminal justice than in the case of journalism. And so that makes a difference, I think, in how the tools are like framed and sold, etc.
Is that really true when you consider market share?
No. Yeah. That's a very good question.
Right, because you want to say there, I mean, if you set on GitHub, you could find like 60 reasonable charting tools.
Yeah. But in terms of like which ones are actually used by newsrooms, yeah, that's a very good point.
Thank you, Angèle, for joining us.
Okay, thanks.